Hello, everyone. We wanted to take a quick moment to thank you all for joining us today. This podcast was recorded and is made available to you by Whitley Penn LLP and WP Wealth LLP solely for informational purposes. The information, views, and opinions expressed in this podcast are general in nature and are not intended to be construed as the provision of financial or investment advice by Whitley Penn or WP Wealth. The information discussed in this podcast is accurate as of the day it was recorded, but may then become outdated over time. Please feel free to contact us if you have any questions, comments, or concerns in regard to the content presented. Thank you again for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy this episode.
Hello, and welcome back to the next installment of Start Now, Success Later. My name is Russ, and I'm an associate advisor at Whitley Penn in the WPWealth Group. This will be the second part of our Big Purchases episode, and today we're going to turn our focus to the question of buying versus leasing a car. What makes the most sense for me? I'm joined today by a very special guest, managing partner of WPWealth, Tom Rein. Tom, how you doing today?
Good, doing good. Looking forward to this. This is an interesting topic.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited. I've never personally leased a car before, so a lot of these questions I came up with really on my own, but I'm excited to have you walk us through it. Can you quickly introduce yourself and what you do here at WP Wealth?
Yeah, you bet. As you mentioned, I'm the managing partner of WP Wealth. We started our group probably 18, 20 years ago, working with clients and helping them, make financial decisions. So not only investing, but decisions on buying homes and financing homes and buying cars and really all things financial as it affects their personal life.
Yeah, Tom's kind of a big deal around WP Wealth. This must be how Joe Rogan felt when he had Elon Musk on.
Not sure about that, but we'll go with it.
So during our planning conversations leading up to recording this, Tom, you had said that at one point you held a dealer's license for selling cars. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, it was kind of a fun deal. I at a certain time of my life, I was very interested in cars, and a buddy of mine and I decided that it would be neat to have firsthand experience of going to auction and buying some nice cars. So we went through the process of applying with the state and got our dealer's license. And what we realized was that it was a lot of work. And the work outstripped the benefits, if you will. So didn't last long. We did buy a couple cars for ourselves and cars that we resold, but we shut that down. But it was a great experience. Learned a lot and got a little inside knowledge on the car business, if you will.
Very interesting. Before we really start to dive into the pros and cons of both leasing and buying, I think there's a few questions you might need to ask yourself first. Tom, what is the first question someone should be asking themselves when they're looking for a new set of wheels?
Yeah, I think as you and I kind of talked about it when we were planning, it's kind of a matrix, a decision tree, if you will, because people buy cars or buy transportation vehicles for a lot of reasons. And I think it really makes a difference on which direction you go depending on what you're trying to accomplish. So, ultimately, are you just looking for a car to get you from point A to point B, or are there some other motives, be it ego, or you're a techie person, or you're afraid of dealing with maintenance or problems? So, those are some of the considerations that you'll want to go through in determining, what route you want to take in regards to acquiring either through lease or purchase a car. And everybody has different reasons for that. So it would be different for everybody.
So who would be the ideal candidate to buy a car then as opposed to leasing?
So it's really all about economics. So an ideal person to buy a car would be somebody that typically would hold a car longer, isn't as interested in updating a car with new features and new technology that comes out pretty rapidly, is probably more interested in just having a reliable means of transportation. There's probably not a lot of ego or other subjective attributes that are important to them. That's probably a better candidate for a buy. So generally, own a car longer, um, unsure about the usage, because when you lease, we'll talk about there's some limitations that you need to be aware of, and because it's an economic decision, somebody that's interested in getting the most value. So having the most value driving experience would be somebody that would be more focused on buying versus leasing.
Right. And something to keep in mind when we're talking about buying a car is it doesn't have to be a new car. You can also consider pre-owned or something like that.
Yeah, and to that end, I talked about economics. It's economically cheaper to buy a car. It's the most economical to buy a pre-owned car because, as we all know and have heard, the minute you drive off a lot, you've probably recognized 20 or 25% depreciation off the sticker price. So, if you were able to find a low mileage car that met your needs, that's going to be the most economical way of acquiring it. So absolutely.
Yeah, so depreciation, that's definitely one of the drawbacks from buying a car. What would be some of the other downsides?
Higher monthly. If you didn't have, if you weren't buying a car for cash, that if you were making payments, your monthly payment would be higher, just because you're financing it over a shorter period of time. And there's lots of attributes that go into the payment. So, if you bought a pre-owned, maybe there's some maintenance issues that you step into. But mainly it's getting into it. The cost, interest rate, maybe some of the financing terms would be the biggest difference from leasing.
And what about benefits of buying a car?
The benefits is that you're not mandated to have to do something after a certain period of time. So if you like the car and it's still in good shape, you can drive it for as long as you want. Once it's paid for, your monthly cash flow, improves significantly. You don't have any more payment. If you are going to drive it for a long period of time, it's very economical, and you don't have to worry about dings and scratches on a car you own that, because you're not turning it back in, that you may be subject to excess wear and tear charges if it was a lease. So inevitably people get door dings and nicks and chips, and that may cost you more if you lease it and turning it in. If I own it, it's just my car. And the other big benefit is, when it's time to get a new car, you have some value that you can use as a trade-in or sale or what have you.
Definitely that helps towards the down payment of your next car for sure. Also, you can make modifications to cars that you buy. If you lease it, can't do that. Can't put those big 22-inch rims on
Exactly
your leased car.
Nor would you want to, because you lose the value of that. Yeah,
right. So what about leasing then? Who would be the ideal candidate to lease a car?
So, if I think about it, and I'll tell you, I've leased and purchased myself in the past. So somebody that would be interested in leasing over buying is somebody that likes current models. And, manufacturers make adjustments or tweaks to most of their models on an annual basis, either through adding technology or some design change. So there's a lot of folks out there that are very techy, that like always to have the most current and latest version. Somebody that is maybe not that savvy about repairs, that they just never want to get stuck in a car that gives them a problem. So you think about it, if you're leasing, you're probably trading cars every 3 years, which means they're probably all under warranty. So you're not having to worry about a big repair bill. There's other costs, but that's not a cost that you have to worry about. So maybe dependability. You have a limited availability of cash flow on a monthly basis to allocate towards that. Even though it costs you more, it's actually less on a monthly basis, more over the life of it. So that would be another reason why somebody might want to consider that as a benefit. Just, kind of satisfaction that, I'm driving something new regularly, I'm not going to have a problem. And I like the ability to do that. And the other big benefit is, especially if you leased a car that was a fairly new model that didn't have a lot of history, If you bought it and decided to trade it in, the market may be really soft, where when you lease a car, you know exactly what the residual value is at the end of it. And so you avoid getting stuck in a financial loss if it was the wrong car, the car didn't turn out to be a good quality car.
Can you kind of explain what residual value is for some of our listeners who may not know?
Yeah, so that's one of the factors that you'll deal with in a lease car. So, you're basically renting the car versus when you buy it, you're owning it, obviously. You don't actually have title to the car. So one of the factors that's important in a lease or the lease calculation is residual. And the residual is basically a percentage of the original cost or value of the car that the industry or the experts will assign to that particular model, depending on the term and the mileage of your lease. So for example, a 3-year, 36-month lease with maybe 15,000 miles allowed a year may have a residual of 52%, which means that at the end of the 3-year period, the value of that lease would be the payoff or the residual balloon of that lease would be 52% of the purchase price. And so that's what you're not paying. That's I guess the cash flow benefit is you're not paying that for that 52% of the residual value.
If you decided to buy your car at the end of the lease, that would pretty much be the sticker price you would pay then?
Yeah, that's negotiated at the time of lease. It's interesting. Some people do, but you typically wouldn't want to buy a lease out. And the reason for that is you're going to have to pay sales tax again. So because you never owned it, you don't have title, so you're going to have to pay sales tax. You're also buying a car that's probably out of warranty, and the price you pay, the residual value, may be more than what you're able to negotiate, either from a third party or from a dealer that may be selling a pre-owned. And you may be stepping into a point where you are experiencing maybe some repairs that are going to need to be done in year 4 or 5 or what have you. So it typically, if you're going that route, you want to buy it on the front end. You don't want to lease it and then experience all the costs associated with buying it. That would be the worst financial decision.
Okay.
Versus stepping into another lease at that point. Again, step into another lease, your cash flow is lower. You got a car that's in full warranty. You have all those other attributes of a brand new car that you're not having to worry about putting money into at that point.
All right. So outside of residual value, what other variables should be considered that can affect the monthly cost of your lease?
That's an interesting question because most people, I read an article one time that leasing, I think, is predominantly the majority of the transactions. And most people don't consider themselves as a leasing candidate. But when they get into a dealer showroom and start talking to a salesperson, they wind up leasing. So that, I don't know if that's a testament to the skill of the salesperson, or the lack of knowledge from the consumer.
Maybe a little
both. Yeah, but most people when they look at a lease, all they focus on is the payment. And a dealer is going to show you a comparison between a purchase payment and a lease payment. And sometimes it's very shocking, the difference. And so a person may gravitate to a lower payment thinking they're actually getting a deal. What most people don't realize is you can negotiate the price of the car for a lease, and it actually is in your best interest to do that. And I'll explain why that is as we kind of go through the mechanics of it. So yes, you definitely can negotiate the price. Another important factor is the residual value, right? So what percentage of that purchase price am I not paying for that's going to be left at the end of the lease? Something called money factor is very misunderstood. And a lot of times people that sell or lease cars don't communicate what that really is clearly to the consumer. The term of the lease, and another really important factor is the number of miles that you're allowed to drive the car. So those are all variables and factors that go into calculating what the lease payment is. Several of those are very misunderstood by consumers. And I think if you're going to lease, you need to be educated about those so you can go in and get the best possible outcome that you can. The other things I think that you need to be aware of, and we'll go into those in detail, but the other thing to be aware of is that most leases also require a termination fee that's built into the lease agreement, that anywhere between $350 to $600 at the end of the lease you have to pay to the dealer for them to take the car back and retitle it and make ready. So that's another cost that a lot of times on the front end you're not thinking about. 36 month, what happens there? And obviously there's wear and tear, excess wear and tear charges. So if a dealer believes that there's excess wear and tear on the car than what should be normal, you could be assessed damage charges. Also, most cars that are turned back in usually are at the end of their life for tires. And so you better plan on your lease costs to have to, as you turn it in, replace a set of tires, because even if they're not bald or in bad shape, they're probably below the threshold that the dealer would consider normal wear and tear. And that could be another, $600 to $1,200 of cost to be able to turn that car back in. And then of course there's the excess mileage. So if you leased the car with a certain number of miles and exceeded it, that could cost you anywhere between 20 and 25 cents per mile in additional cost for any mileage over the allotment. So those are things to consider about the variables in a lease.
It really sounds like they try and nickel and dime you at the end.
And it is truly the most expensive way of getting in a car, but the marketing of it is presented as a lower cost option. But if you took, and I've seen an analysis done, if you took a 6-year window and you bought a car and financed it over, let's say, 4 years. So you paid for it for 4 years, your monthly payment was higher, but the last 2 years of a lease, you had no payment. And then you leased 2 cars successive in 3-year leases for a period of 6 years. The cost differential to the consumer is staggeringly different. Significantly more for that 6-year driving experience for a lease versus a car. And at the end of the 6 years, you have no value in the lease, and you potentially have some residual value or fair market value in the car, which means you can drive it longer, or you can trade it in and have some money to apply towards the next car. So while it may be presented as a lower monthly cost, the actual cost of ownership over a 6-year period, say, is much higher to lease the car.
Gotcha. They just keep pushing that lower monthly payment, though.
Yeah, and for a lot of people, that's important.
Yeah.
If your budget is very limited, again, if you have a way of making it work financially, it's the cheaper way to drive a car is to buy it. But again, some people are really focused on the monthly cash flow.
Can you kind of explain a breakdown between money factor versus APR? So money factor is kind of the interest rate as assessed to a lease, whereas an APR is the interest rate assessed to a buy.
Correct. And you got to think about it this way. Whether I'm leasing or buying, I'm still financing something. So somebody is buying that car from the dealer, and they're using their capital to buy that asset. And so typically it's a lease finance company or some lease, the dealer doesn't hold the lease agreement. They're selling it off to a financing arm or another leasing financing company. So they need to be compensated both for the use, depreciation of the car, and for their extending capital for 3 years or 4 years or however long the lease is for. So when you buy something, you're used to seeing an interest rate. So whether it's zero or something higher than zero, it's stated as an interest rate, an annual percentage rate, and that's used to apply against the purchase price of the car over the term of the purchase. And so you calculate a payment. The cost of money, or the money factor, is a term used in the leasing world that, in my opinion, is used to be distortive, because if and again, I know these things. So if I go into a dealer and I say, and they're quoting me a payment, for example, on a lease, and I say, I'll ask this question every time, and I can promise you, I know the answer that I get back. I'll ask, what's the interest rate on the factoring this payment? And the answer is, well, there isn't an interest rate. And so I just know that answer. And I said, well, let me rephrase it differently. What's the money factor? Oh, the money factor it's really tiny. It's 0.000138. And you're like, well, what does that mean? Well, what that means is that's the way leasing companies break down their interest rate. They call it a money factor, and it's some very small decimal amount. But if you multiply that by 2,400, it equates it to an effective interest rate. So if they quote you a very low decimal money factor and you multiply that by 2,400, it'll come out to the interest rate. So now you can compare what interest rate they're using to come to that payment and compare whether you have the opportunity to get a lower rate at your bank or your credit union, or if you had money in the bank that was earning next to nothing in a savings account or money market, would it be more effective to use that money versus to pay the money factor, which essentially is interest. And you got to think about the interest factor on a lease is twofold. It's the interest on the residual value that is capital expended by the leasing company. So there's money spent that's just sitting out there waiting for the third year to come. So they're charging you interest on that money. And then there's interest on the part of the capitalization costs or the depreciation that you're paying monthly. So there's a charge of interest on that. So there's really two components of interest that effectively equate to an interest rate, but you have to sometimes dig a little deeper with the dealer to get the true information so that you can evaluate whether you have better options, lower interest rates anywhere else.
And is the money factor negotiable as part of the lease?
Yeah, because most dealers have multiple sources of financing. They may have, if you go to a GM dealer, they may have GMAC, but they may have relationships with other big banks. Toyota Motor Credit would have that, Lexus or Toyota would be Lexus, but Honda's got their own financing arm, but they also have other financial institutions that they'll go to that will have different interest rates. Sometimes it depends on your credit score, whether you'll qualify for one lender versus another, but there are certainly different interest rates. And the more knowledgeable you are going into a deal, the better questions you could ask, and then ultimately get the better deal for yourself.
All right. So I know that if you buy a car, like for example, a Toyota Camry is one of the sturdiest cars that holds its value forever. Are there certain cars that are better to lease than others?
Yeah, I think to that point, there are certain cars that I would say you can just drive down the road and look and count how many of this Honda or this Toyota or this Ford are out there. So obviously, the more popular a car, the more stable the residual value would be. And all you're concerned about is at the end of the lease, having a car that has the highest residual value, which means you're paying the lowest depreciation amount. So you want to make sure it's a quality car that after 3 years is still going to be desirable. There's certain cars that are used in all market segments, all income levels and age groups, and those would be cars that have the higher demand, so the residual values are probably stronger. So if you have to lease because cash flows dictate, you want to look for a car, maybe put ego aside and look for a car that has high demand and high quality rating that will be worth something after the lease term. And you may have the lowest depreciation that you're going to have to pay on a car like that because the residual value typically will be higher after the lease term.
Okay. So kind of similar to that, right now, pretty much whether you're leasing or buying, we're seeing extremely low inventories across all makes and models. So will that play a part into the lease or I guess buy?
Yeah, I think so. And I think in both, we all are inundated in normal times with ads from car manufacturers about incentives and rebates and, this much off. And that's because they typically have excess inventory. And especially if it's in a period where they're changing model years over, they want to clear off prior year model inventory. And so they're willing to offer discounts and incentives. We're certainly not seeing that now, whether it's from a supply chain issue or, we hear about computer chip problems that's slowing down production, or just supply chain disruptions that are really slowing down inventory. You couple with that with the issue of the rental industry. During COVID in 2020, rental car companies sold off all their inventory because they weren't going to sit there for a year holding this expensive, valuable inventory without getting any revenue on it. So they sold it off. Now they're trying to restock all of their fleet needs. At the same time, there's a production shortage. So you got a real tight inventory situation now. So dealers are not having to discount. We're entering the time of year where the 22 models should be rolling in pretty soon. But if there's no 21 models left, or very limited inventory, they're not going to have to deal. So when I talked about previously on a lease that you can negotiate the purchase price, and that goes in directly impacting or lowering your payment, you're not maybe going to be able to discount. You may not have flexibility on interest rate, even though cost of money is so cheap right now. If there's a high demand for the product, and finance companies feel like they can move rates up because ultimately somebody's going to buy the car, and you don't have the ability to pay cash for it, you're going to have to pay a higher rate. So I would say if you're in a market now and you don't have any choice, you're probably looking at paying more today for the same car as you would have 6 months ago. So if you have flexibility, if you can hang on to your car, if you don't have a lease expiring, you want to consider being a little patient. What people really don't realize either is that if you're in a lease, you actually can extend your lease month to month for a number of months under your lease agreement, that they'll let you continue paying at that same, monthly allowance, if you will, on mileage. So if you feel like things are going to improve in a period of time and you have a lease coming up, you may consider continuing to pay on that lease longer to the extent your contract allows you. And then maybe the inventory problem resolves itself and you can get in a situation where there's more models to choose from with the features you want, and maybe at little lower prices if the pressure off the inventory subsides a bit.
So are there anything else or other things that I should consider? I was looking online and I saw something about gap insurance for lease cars. Is that essential?
Depending on your coverage, you need to ask the question of your insurer. What gap insurance is basically insuring the difference between what your insurance company may deem a total loss and what the residual payoff of that lease is. So, for example, if I have a car whose unpaid balance is, call it $30,000, but my insurance company says a total loss is only worth $25,000, then you're stuck. And so that's where gap insurance comes in, which obviously is an additional cost. So you want to make sure that your insurer gives you the commitment that they're going to pay the balance off in the event of a loss. The other consideration is some states charge personal property tax on the lease car. Not every state's the same, but some states do that. And it's a surprise a lot of time to new leasees who aren't aware of that. They may get a bill from their county tax assessor at the end of the year for a personal property tax assessment. That may be an additional cost that they weren't aware of. And I would say just generally, don't get caught up in a lower monthly cash flow. Leasing is more expensive, without a doubt. And if your goals are to have a more cost-effective driving experience and you have flexibility in your budget, then you want to avoid leasing and really focus on buying.
All right. Are there any resources out there for people to check out, maybe a calculator to compare, or a spreadsheet, worksheet for someone who can kind of break down the total costs?
Yeah, I've looked online. There's several tools, and I actually built kind of one myself that I've used in the past. And I would encourage folks that are shopping and considering a lease, if they've got a quote from a dealer, that they find one of these online tools that they could put the known variables that they have to identify what the cost of the unknown variables are. So if you've got a payment and they've told you what your purchase price is and all of that, you can probably figure out what your money factor, or i.e. your interest rate is. You really can't negotiate your residual value. That's done by industry, but you certainly can negotiate on the purchase price and potentially the financing cost. So I wouldn't just take the word for it. I would always go into a dealership with the mindset that I'm going to walk out with an offer, that I'm not going to commit to anything there, because typically the pressure that is put on to you makes you make a poor decision. That if you can walk out with a commitment from them, you're probably going to get a better option to evaluate. And that also gives you time to do some research to make sure that you're understanding all the variables. And if you have other dealers in the marketplace that are providing the same product, you can shop it around and make sure that you get the best deal. And even on a lease, and people don't realize this, even on a lease, you can go back and forth with dealers if you've got a comparable car with similar features and price to negotiate a better monthly payment. And certainly that's the case in purchasing. There's a lot more variables that maybe are available to you that would affect your affordability, whether it's stretching out the payment term and an attractive interest rate or what have you. So I would say go into a dealer with the mindset that I am not making a decision. And I would tell you more times than not, you're going to walk out with what they feel their best deal is, because they're not going to let you leave with bad information or taking a higher quote than what they're willing to give you to shop around in a marketplace. Ultimately, they want to sell cars. They want you to sign when you're there, but they'll take you when you come back too, and they're not going to let you leave without their best information, because chances are you're not going to come back.
Yeah, those car salesmen are relentless. Do you have any final thoughts to wrap this topic up?
I would tell you again, as where we started on this deal, it really is a decision tree. It's kind of a matrix of decisions, identifying what your goals are, what's important to you, how you view that car, whether it's an extension of your personality or whether it's a tool as a means to an end, really will help drive you in the right direction. Just know that you will be pressured to make a decision, and the higher the pressure, the more difficult it will be to resist. But just know that in leasing or buying, you have flexibility, and the more you understand, the more you're educated about it, the better decision that you'll ultimately make.
All right. Tom, thank you for coming on. It was a pleasure having you. And everyone, thank you for tuning in again this week. Please like, comment, and subscribe to the Whitley Penn Talks podcast channel wherever you listen to your podcast. And also visit our new website, WPWealth.com, and give us a follow on LinkedIn. We'll see you guys soon. Thanks.